Welcome to my channel, folks. I'm Joanna Harris, your storyteller of American folklore, unsolved mysteries, and all kinds of wild tales. Join me today for a story called The Beggar's Gift. It's about Agi who promises, il grant you a lifetime of blessings. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's dive into this one. It's a wild ride from the late colonial era. Back in the late 1700s, during the tail end of the colonial period in Virginia, there was a woman named Margaret Harris who'd married into the Cooper family in the small town of Upper Jade. She had two daughters, Joan Cooper and Abigail Cooper. Joan, the older sister, was born with a twisted leg, and half her face bore a big greenish birthmark on the left side. Abigail, the younger one, was a knockout, gorgeous face, curvy figure, the whole package. Side by side, these sisters were like night and day, one striking the other well not so much. Joan, with her rough looks, didn't have high hopes for her future. Around Upper Jade and the nearby 10 miles of farmland and hamlets, not a single guy ever showed up at the Cooper doorstep to ask for her hand. Meanwhile, Abigail's beauty had matchmakers practically wearing out the path to their house. She turned down proposals left and right. Abigail had big dreams and high standards. Your average young farmhand or merchant's son didn't cut it for her. Every few days, some hopeful matchmaker would knock, but if the guy didn't meet Abigail's checklist, wealth, charm, ambition, she'd send them packing without a second thought. One day, Joan limped home from the creek with a bucket of fresh water. She stepped inside just as a matchmaker, Widow Nancy, was chatting up her mom Margaret. Joan didn't pay it much mind. Matchmakers were always about Abigail, not her. She hauled the bucket over to the water barrel and dumped it in, splashing a little on her patched-up dress. Margaret walked over, frowning at Joan's scarred face and uneven gait. She sighed. This girl works hard, I'll give her that, Margaret thought. But born with that limp and that mark, she's 20-something now, and still no suitors. I'm worried sick. But today was different. Widow Nancy had some news that actually perked Margaret up. Turns out, a guy from Purple Hollow, a little settlement nearby, had taken a shine to Joan. His name was Thomas Reed, and he'd sent Nancy to propose on his behalf. Margaret's heart lifted, a weight off her chest. Joan might finally get hitched. She turned to Joan, who was wiping her hands on her apron. Put that down for a sec, Margaret said. Thomas Reed from Purple Hollow's asking for you, not your sister. He picked you. Go clean yourself up. I'll tell Nancy to pick a good wedding date. You're getting married. Joan froze, stunned. She'd figured Nancy was there for Abigail, like always. Her being the bride? That threw her for a loop. After a beat, she mustered up the courage to ask, Ma, how old's this Thomas guy? Joan's stomach churned, half nervous, half hopeful. She worried he'd be some old widower, past his prime. Most young bucks wouldn't look twice at her, so an older guy seemed likely. But part of her dared to dream. Every girl's got a spark of hope, right? She knew she wasn't much to look at, but if he had a few flaws too, she could live with that. Anything to get out of this house where she'd always been the odd one out. Margaret never hid her favoritism for Abigail. Margaret pursed her lips and said, Thomas Reed's 56. Don't you go complaining he's old. If his wife hadn't just passed, he wouldn't even be looking your way. Oh, and he's got a grown daughter already. Listen, Joan, you're no preacher yourself, ugly as sin, folks say. Years gone by, and this is the first nibble we've had. You don't get to be picky. If his wife was still alive, a chance like this wouldn't even come knocking. I've already said yes to Nancy, so you're set. Just get ready. Joan's heart sank like a stone. She was barely 20, still in her prime, and this guy was pushing 60? Marrying someone old enough to be her grandpa felt like getting shoved into a ditch. But in those days, parents called the shots, and matchmakers sealed the deal. Joan couldn't say no. She swallowed hard, went to her room, and pulled out the red fabric she'd always dreamed of wearing someday. It wasn't fancy, just a few yards of cheap cloth she'd sewn into a dress herself. She got dressed, dabbed on some rouge, and tried to make peace with it. Wedding day rolled around, and Thomas sent a couple of hired hands with a simple sedan chair to fetch Joan. After picking her up from Upper Jade, they hauled her off to Purple Hollow. Funny thing, she didn't even meet Thomas until the ceremony. Word spread fast that old man Reed, over 50, was tying the knot again. Villagers piled in to gawk. A wedding was rare entertainment back then, especially for a guy his age. Rumor had it Thomas shelled out a piglet as a bride price. Not much, but enough. Folks whispered about the bride too, ugly as a mud fence, they said, with that green splotch on her face. At his age, they figured, that's about all he could snag. No young belle would hitch herself to a greybeard like him.
Joan stepped out of the sedan, limping a little, and the crowd snickered.
Pointing, laughing, look at her hobble. Ain't that a sight? Joan was used to it.
Shed was the growing up.
Didn't faze her much anymore. Widow Nancy bustled over, all business, and ushered her into Thomas's rough-hewn cabin. Under the eyes of the nosy neighbors, they went through the vows, simple, quick, no fuss. Joan figured she could settle into this new life. Sure, Thomas Reed was old, gray hair, weathered hands, but if he treated her decent, she'd make it work. Days could be good, she told herself.
Not long after the wedding, Joan got pregnant.
The next year, she gave birth to a little girl. What warmed her heart most? That baby didn't inherit her green birthmark or her limp. Joan's biggest fear had been passing on her looks, so seeing that smooth, perfect face made her breathe easy for the first time in years. Life in Purple Hollow wasn't exactly rosy, though. The late 1700s were rough, droughts, floods, and raids from outlaws or British stragglers after the Revolution. Folks didn't live long back then. Hitting 60 was a miracle. Thomas, already in his late 50s, was ancient by those standards. Marrying late like he did, he doted on Joan in his own gruff way, fixed the roof when it leaked, brought her wildflowers once. For 2 years, Joan lived without much worry. Hard times came and went, but she had a roof, a husband, and a daughter. That was enough.
Nobody saw it coming.
3 years into the marriage, Thomas went out to the hills to gather herbs, something he'd done 100 times to brew remedies or sell at the market. This time, he didn't come back. Slipped on a ridge, tumbled off a cliff, and that was it. Dead at 59. Joan, barely 23, was a widow with a toddler on her hip.
3 years married, and now this.
Thomas had a son from his first wife, a burly guy named Daniel Reed. After Thomas's body was buried, Daniel didn't waste time. He swooped in, claimed the cabin as his by right, and told Joan to pack up. She had no claim. Widows didn't get much say back then, especially not with a stepson in the picture. So Joan gathered her little girl and what few belongings she could carry, and they ended up in a crumbling old shed outside Purple Hollow.
No husband, no home. That is got brutal fast.
Some mornings, they scraped by on wild greens or stale cornbread. Other times, there was nothing at all. Joan couldn't keep her daughter starving in that shed. Desperate, she trudged back to Upper Jade with the kid in tow, hoping her ma Margaret would take pity. But when Margaret saw Joan limp up to the doorstep, her face soured. To her, Joan was a burden now, a widow with a mouth to feed. Maybe when she'd married Thomas, she'd been worth that piglet bride price, but now, a liability.
Still, blot's blot.
Margaret didn't slam the door, just let them in with a grunt. Joan hadn't been back a few days before the muttering started.
She overheard Abigail griping to Margaret one night by the hearth.
"Ma, how long's she gonna squat here this time?" Abigail hissed. "If some fella comes courting me, what's he gonna think, seeing a widow and her brat in the house?"
"It's bad luck. Puts a hex on my chouses."
Abigail had always been the golden child, never lifted a finger growing up while Joan scrubbed pots and hauled water. After Joan married Thomas, those chores fell to Margaret, and Abigail still acted like a princess. Over the past 3 years, suitors had lined up for Abigail, but her nose was so high she turned them all down. Now pushing her mid-20s, she was getting antsy, worried her looks wouldn't hold forever. Joan's return just rubbed salt in that wound. A widow. Abigail sneered. "How's that supposed to stack up to a catch like me?" Joan caught every word, and it cut deep. That night, she bundled up her daughter and slipped out of the Cooper house before dawn. Back to the shed in Purple Hollow she went, determined to scrape by alone. Widow Nancy, the matchmaker who'd set her up with Thomas, heard about Joan's sorry state. Nancy was a soft touch, felt a twinge of guilt for how things turned out. She tracked Joan down at the shed, lugging a sack of grain and a few coins. "Joan, I messed up pushing that match," Nancy said, eyes downcast. "If I hadn't paired you with Thomas, you wouldn't be in this fix. Take this, it's not much, but it'll keep you going." Joan shook her head. Nancy, it ain't your fault. Blame my rotten luck. I can't take your charity, keep it. Nancy sighed, heavy. Girl, this is on me. Don't argue. And listen, I've got another idea. This time, no hitches, I swear. She didn't wait for Joan to protest, just left the goods and hustled off. Joan stared at the sack and coins. A widow with a 2-year-old, ugly as folks kept saying, who'd want her now? But she didn't touch Nancy's money for herself. Instead, she took a little, vowing to pay it back someday, and headed to the nearest town, Willow Creek, to try her luck. Willow Creek wasn't far from Purple Hollow, and Joan had been there a few times growing up. With Nancy's coins, she rented a tiny room above a tavern, just big enough for her and her girl. Then she hit the market, bought some soybeans, and got to work. Back home, she'd learned to make tofu from a neighbor. Simple, cheap, and folks liked it. She cooked up a batch, loaded it onto a rickety wheelbarrow, and rolled into the market square hollering, "Fresh tofu. Get your fresh tofu here." Business wasn't booming, but it trickled. Enough to buy bread, maybe a scrap of meat now and then. One day, 2 fellas were drinking at a tavern nearby, Nathan Moore and his buddy Jacob Tate. They'd just passed the bar exam to become lawyers, a big deal in those parts. Nathan was drowning his sorrows, though. His wife had died a couple weeks back, and he was a mess. Jacob clapped him on the shoulder. "Nate, she's gone, but you've got a future. We're heading to Richmond next year for bigger cases. Don't let this derail you." Nathan nodded, sipping his whiskey. "I know, Jake. Just feels empty without a woman to run the house. Who's gonna keep things straight?" Jacob grinned. "What's the problem? I'll find you someone, low maintenance, good heart." Nathan started to wave him off, but then his eyes caught something outside. Jacob followed his gaze. There in the bustling market was Joan, limping along, pushing her wheelbarrow, that green birthmark stark on her face. Her dress was patched, her kid clinging to her skirt. Jacob whistled low. "Lord, she's a tough one. Ain't seen a gal like that before, gritty as they come." Nathan nodded slow. "More than gritty. She's got something real about her." Nathan Moore stood up from the tavern table, brushing off his coat. "Jake, hold my drink," he said, and stepped outside. Jacob Tate trailed after him, curious. Nathan walked straight up to Joan's wheelbarrow, eyeing her tofu setup. She didn't notice him at first, just kept arranging the blocks, making sure they looked good. He watched her for a minute. Honest work, fair portions. She wasn't skimping anybody. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Sell me the lot." Joan looked up, startled. Her eyes flicked over this young guy, clean-shaven, decent jacket, not some roughneck. "Sir, I've got a heap here," she said, hesitant. "Tofu's versatile. Fry it, stew it, but you sure you can eat all this? Hate to see it go to waste." Nathan pulled out a handful of silver coins and grinned. "This oughta cover it." Joan's eyes widened, and she waved her hands. "Whoa, that's way too much. 10 cents'll do. I know you've got cash to burn, but don't throw it around like that. Save it for something big." Nathan blinked. Most folks would have snatched the money and run, but here she was, haggling down. He'd meant to help her out, poor gal with a kid, limping through the market, but now he was intrigued. She smiled, just a quick flash, and fished out a tiny coin from his pile, handing the rest back. "This'll cover enough for your family," she said. "Here's your change. Keep it safe." That smile, plain as she was, it lit something up in Nathan. Pure, unguarded, like nothing he'd seen before. And her business sense? Not scared of selling too much, just practical. He liked that. Nathan took the tofu and turned to Jacob. "What'd you think of her, Jake?" Jacob scratched his chin. "Face ain't much, but she's solid. Real salt-of-the-earth type, kinda rare." Nathan nodded. "Exactly what I'm thinking." That day stuck with him. Joan kept at her tofu gig, and bit by bit, life eased up, enough to feed her girl and patch the roof over their heads. Word got around, and Widow Nancy caught wind of where Joan had landed. She showed up at Joan's little room one morning, out of breath. "Lord, girl, you're tough to track down." Nancy panted. "I've got big news, your ticket to something better. Nathan Moore, that lawyer feller in town, his wife passed not long ago. His ma's looking for someone to keep house, and get this, Nathan came to me yesterday. Said he wants a gal with a green mark on her face and a limp. I poked around, and who else fits that bill but you? He's sweet on you, Joan. Joan stared, dumbfounded. Someone picking her, on purpose, no less? She half thought Nancy was pulling her leg. Nancy, I appreciate you trying, but look at me, Joan said. A widow with a kid, who'd want this mess? I'm fine here. Don't fuss over me. Nancy shook her head hard. No, this ain't a joke. Nathan saw you at the market, bought your tofu and all. He's serious. Get yourself ready, it's a good match, I'm telling you. Joan didn't know what to say. She remembered that guy with the coins, kind eyes, steady voice. Her heart thudded, but she brushed it off, tending to her crying daughter instead. Back in Upper Jade, Abigail got wind of the rumor. Somehow, Nancy's big mouth had let it slip that Nathan Moore wanted Joan. Matchmakers still buzzed around the Cooper house for Abigail, but this news hit her like a slap. She cornered Margaret by the fireplace. Ma, what's Joan got going for her? Abigail fumed. This Nathan Moore, lawyer, money, brains, wants to marry her? She's a hobbling widow with a kid and a face like a swamp. He's got to be out of his mind. Abigail couldn't wrap her head around it. The Moores were big shots, land, influence, the works. Nathan had passed the bar, a rising star. Her family could barely dream of that kind of match. Yet here he was, chasing Joan, ugly, broke Joan with her snot-nosed brat. It didn't add up. Sure, Nathan's wife had died, but even so, Joan? Abigail's face twisted. She don't deserve him, she spat. Ma, listen, I've got a plan. She leaned in, whispering low, and Margaret nodded, her eyes glinting. Nancy didn't let Joan wiggle out of it. A few days later, she showed up with a red dress, fancy, store-bought, not some homespun rag, and a pile of gifts from the Moore family. Joan tried to refuse, but Nancy was a bulldog. It's done, girl. Nathan's set on you. Take it or leave it, but it's his call. Time ticked by, and the wedding day rolled up fast. Nathan sent a team of hired hands with a proper carriage to fetch Joan from Willow Creek. The plan was to bring her back to the Moore estate, a sprawling place with white fences and a big porch. The estate was decked out, red ribbons, green wreaths, folks milling around, laughing loud. Nathan was all grins, bustling about, making sure everything was perfect. But Abigail had been scheming. She'd shown up at Joan's place earlier, playing nice, just here to help sis. And slipped something into Joan's tea. A sleeping draught, strong enough to knock her out cold. While Joan was slumped over, Abigail swapped into the red dress, dolled herself up, and climbed into the carriage instead. A perfect switch, nobody suspected a thing. The ceremony went off smooth. Nathan, under the preacher's watch, said his vows to the veiled bride. They got hitched, and he led her to the bridal room, beaming. But when he lifted the veil that night, expecting Joan's green-marked face, he staggered back 3 steps. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. It wasn't Joan. It was Abigail, prettier than a picture, but not the woman he'd picked. Abigail fluttered her lashes, cool as ice. "Sorry, Nathan," she purred. "Joan's my sister. I've always admired you, your smarts, your success. Joan didn't want to remarry after Thomas, so I stepped in. We're married now, husband and wife, right?" Nathan's jaw tightened. They'd said the vows, sure, legally, she was his wife. Abigail was a stunner, no denying that. But she wasn't Joan. "Even if Joan didn't want this," he said, voice like steel, "I don't want you. Sleep hier to nicht, I'm out." He stormed out, slamming the door. Abigails Eis fläschet venom. Chauvet avoden vase auf the table, chatteringité. "What's wrong with him?" she hissed. "I'm pretier corvir. Better tan her in everve. I've had suitors lining up for years. Am I not good enough for him?" Nathan heard the crash from the hall and shook his head. This was a mess. What was he supposed to do? Swallow it and live with her? No chance. She'd tricked him, and he wasn't playing along. The next morning, Nathan tracked down Widow Nancy at her little shop in Willow Creek. He barged in, face stormy, and laid it out. "Nancy, wat in Gods Name happenet?" "I asked for Joan, and I ended up with her sister, Abigail. How'd this go so wrong? Nancy's jaw dropped. Lord Nathan, I swear I didn't pull a fast one. I told Joan clear as day, you wanted her. That sister of hers, Abigail, she's got suitors out the ears but aims higher than a kite. I never figured she'd stoop to this. Nathan rubbed his temples.
I don't blame you, Nancy.
I should have double-checked. But now what? Joan's the one I wanted, her heart, not her looks. Abigail's a beauty, sure, but she ain't who I picked. Joan's done with marrying, she says, and I ain't keen on keeping Abigail. I'm stuck. Nancy fumed, pacing.
That girls, folks, Margaret and Abigail, pulled a dirty trick.
First, they pawned Joan off on Thomas Reed, and now this? Shameless. Give me a minute, Nathan, I've got an idea to fix it and get Joan to come around. She leaned in, whispering her plan, and Nathan's eyes lit up.
Allrecht, Nancy.
If it works, I'm in.
Word of the bride swap spread like wildfire trug Willow Creek and Apayade.
Folks couldn't stop yapping about it over supper. Ugly Joan swapped for pretty Abigail, and Nathan Moore still mad as a hornet? It was the juiciest gossip in years. Most figured he'd lucked out, Abigail was a catch by any measure, but Nathan didn't see it that way. To outsiders, the Moore estate got played, plain and simple. Nathan kept his distance from Abigail, dodging her at the house. She strutted around, sure he'd cave eventually, beauty like hers always won out, right? But 2 months after the wedding, Nathan took sick.
No fever, no cough. Just wasting weh, pale and weak.
Before long he was gone, dead just like that.
Abigail, Barelia bride, was avido again. When the news hit Joan back in Willow Creek, she sat down hard, staring at nothing.
Widow Nancy came by, grim-faced. Since he hitched Abigail, Nathan wouldn't touch a drop of tea with her, Nancy said. He pined for you, Joan, probably what killed him. Joan couldn't believe it.
A man like Nathan, smart, steady, hung up on her? Enough to the over it?
It broke something inside her. That night, she stayed up, sewing a simple jacket and a pair of shoes by candlelight. Come morning, she marched to the Moore estate, ignoring the stares, and demanded to see Nathan's coffin. She dressed him in her handmade gear, tears streaming as she worked, then collapsed against the wood, sobbing. She hadn't known anyone could care that much. Now he was gone, and her chest felt hollow. Joan hadn't meant to fall for Nathan. She dodged his proposal out of shame, convinced a cripple with a marked face didn't deserve a man like him.
When Abigail stepped in, Joan let it slide. No resentment, just quiet acceptance.
Nathan was a gentleman, Abigail's looks matched his station. But now, knowing he'd wanted her all along, regret gnawed at her. She wished she'd grabbed his hand when she had the chance. Abigail watched Joan's breakdown with a smirk. Real touching, she muttered. He's dead now, what's the point of crying? Joan didn't bite back. She stayed by Nathan's side, seeing him through the burial, then left the Moore estate behind. A year passed. Joan kept selling tofu, raising her girl, trying to fill the emptiness. Then one day, 2 riders showed up in front of the Moore place, official types with a proclamation. They read it out, and minutes later, 2 men on horseback rolled in. One was Jacob Tate, grinning wide.
The author? Nathan Moore. Leave as you please.
Jake, you're laying it on thick, Nathan laughed, clapping his friend's shoulder. 2nd place in the Richmond bar exams ain't bad, but you're the real star, 3rd place and all.
Jakob Gufavet. Get on home, Nate.
You've got a mess to clean up. Nathan turned to the estate, eyes heavy. Turns out, a year back, he'd taken Nancy's advice for a wild scheme. She knew an old herbalist, a backwoods type, who brewed a potion from some rare root. It'd lock up Nathan's breath, make him look dead as a doornail for a spell. A fake-out to test the sisters, see who'd show their true colors. After the burial, Jacob had dug him up quick, hauled him to the herbalist to reverse the trick, and Nathan came back swinging. He and Jacob rode to Richmond, aced the bar exams. Nathan snagged 2nd, Jacob 3rd, and now he was back to settle things. He'd set up spies at the estate, keeping tabs. What he found out wasn't pretty. Inside the Moore house, Abigail was cozied up with some slick fella. Look, next time, pick a spot that ain't so creepy, the guy whined. Every day here's giving me the jitters. Abigail rolled her eyes. What are you scared of, Nathan's ma, or his ghost?
I ain't afraid. Once I ditch the old lady, this place is ours.
She'd been scheming since Nathan died, pushing to split the estate, teaming up with this crook to siphon off the cash. Nathan's ma, Clara Moore, was a tough nut though. She'd moved most of the valuables, silver, deeds, the lot, somewhere safe, leaving Abigail with scraps and fakes. Clara got wise, thanks to a letter Nathan sent, and washed her hands of Abigail. Right then, the front door crashed open. Nathan stormed in with a posse of constables. Abigail's eyes bugged out, ghost or man, she couldn't tell. You alive or dead? She stammered.
Alive enough to catch you, Nathan snapped.
You swapped in, schemed with this lowlife, now you're done. The constables clapped irons on Abigail and her beau, dragging them off to the county jail. Nathan handed Abigail a divorce paper, legal as could be, and the judge later sentenced her to the stocks. She didn't last long after that. Shame and sickness took her out. When Joan heard Nathan was back, and a big-shot lawyer now, she couldn't believe it. Nancy filled her in on the whole ruse, the fake death, the test, everything. This time, Joan didn't run. She faced Nathan square, accepted his proposal, and they tied the knot proper. Life at the Moore estate bloomed under Joan's hand, organized, warm, thriving. She earned Nathan a reputation as a fair, decent man, and folks sang their praises for years. A century later, people still told the tale. Looks fade, but a good heart lasts. The good get their due in the end.
Allrecht, folks. That's the end of Joan and Nathan's story.
Hope you enjoyed it. Drop a comment below if you did, and don't forget to subscribe and share. Next up, we've got a wild one called The Greedy Outlaw.
It's got bandits, a clever wife, and a twist you won't see coming.
Here's the tagline, thanks for the mercy, mister. So let's head back to the early 1800s and meet our new crew. Out in Shewan Hollow, Virginia, around 1805, lived Jonathan Lewis, a bookworm through and through. He loved his studies, history, law, anything he could get his hands on. Farm work, though, that fell square on his wife, Sarah Lewis. She hauled water, chopped wood, and kept the chickens fed, all on her own. Money was tight, real tight. Their cabin was drafty, the roof leaked, and some days supper was just cornbread and gravy. But Sarah never complained. She was practical, steady, and believed in Jonathan.
Somede, she tell him, you're gonna make it big.
I know it. Jonathan appreciated her faith. Seeing her sweat it out for him lit a fire under him. He'd stay up late, hunched over candlelight with a quill, studying harder than ever. Trouble was, luck wasn't on his side. He started taking the county exams at 18, hoping to land a clerk job or something steady. By his 40s, he was still at it, flunking every time. Poor as dirt, still just a dreamer with a shelf of battered books. Spring of 1805 rolled around, and Jonathan decided to give it one last shot. He and his son, James Lewis, headed to Richmond for the state exams. James was a chip off the old block, smart, driven, but with better timing. Results came in, and James nailed it, second place statewide, a ticket to a bright future.
Jonathan? Bombed again.
Still, seeing James shine felt like a win. His boy had done what he couldn't. Jonathan hung up his quill for good after that, settling in as Shewan Hollow schoolmaster, teaching kids their letters for a few coins a week. The Lewis family had always been dirt poor, so James hadn't had much luck with the ladies. Nobody wanted to marry into a shack. But now, with his exam win, suitors' parents came knocking. Matchmakers buzzed around, and James settled on Emily Carter, a sharp girl from a decent Richmond family. The state appointed James as a magistrate in Grayson County, way down south near the Tennessee line. Wedding plans moved fast. 3 days after James and Emily tied the knot, they packed up, Emily grabbing her dowry cash, and hit the road for Grayson. Grayson County was a haul from Shewan Hollow, hundreds of miles through rough country. They'd need to travel by river partway, so James and Emily booked passage on a big flatboat heading south. Things went smooth till they hit a trading post near the Cumberland River. There they switched to a smaller boat to finish the trip, just them, a scarred middle-aged boatman, and 3 young roughnecks. Overhearing the crew talk, James picked up their names, Sam Holt, Will Brady, and Tom Duffy. The boatman? They called him Scarface Jack, real name Jackson Burke. Word was, Jack was an ex-outlaw, wanted up north for robbery, now laying low with his gang, running this boat on the sly. Jack had sworn off crime years back, or so he claimed. But when he laid eyes on Emily, petite, bright-eyed, hair like honey, something dark stirred in him. He started plotting. James and Emily, clueless, were just happy to be nearing Grayson. James, feeling good, pulled out a sketchpad and drew Emily a picture, a big blooming rose, detailed down to the thorns. "Like it, darlin'?" he asked, handing it over. Emily's face lit up. "It's beautiful, James, like a promise of good days ahead. You're too good to me." She studied the sketch, tracing the petals with her finger, so real she could almost smell it. James took her hand. "Marrying you's the best luck I ever had, must have taken lifetimes to earn it. I'll love you till I'm dust, Em, never leaving you." He pulled her close, and she nestled against him, listening to his heartbeat. "I'll stick by you too," she whispered, shy but sure. "Till we're old and gray, together forever." They laughed, swapped more sweet words, then sat down with a jug of cider, happy as could be. Up at the boat's bow, Scarface Jack peeked through a crack in the cabin wall, watching them. His blood boiled, jealousy, greed, the works. He shot a look at his crew, Sam, Will, and Tom, and winked. A signal. They nodded, and Jack leaned in, muttering a plan. The boat veered off the main channel, drifting toward a lonely stretch of reeds. Night fell heavy, perfect cover for trouble. Inside the cabin, James and Emily were lost in each other, no idea what was brewing outside. Suddenly, the cabin door banged open. Jack and his boys burst in, knives flashing. They pinned James and Emily down, blades at their throats. James fought to stay calm, heart pounding. "What'd you want?" he demanded, voice steady as he could manage. Emily trembled, biting her lip. Tears streaked her face, but she didn't scream. Jack grinned, nasty and wide. "This little lady's a peach," he said, eyeing Emily. "I'm taking her. Tie her up, boys." James lunged, fury boiling over. "Let her go, you bastard," he yelled. Sam Holt kicked him hard in the ribs, snarling, "Shut it, or you'll regret it." Jack loomed over Emily. "Here's the deal, sweetheart, come with me, and he lives. Say no, and you're both fish food." Emily's eyes locked on James, tears pouring. He shook his head fierce. "Don't do it, Em." She sobbed, then turned to Jack. "All right, I'll go. Just let him go." Jack's goal was Emily, not murder. He didn't slit James's throat, just had the boys toss him overboard into the churning river. Emily, bound tight, watched helpless as he hit the water, screaming his name till her voice broke. Lucky for James, he'd learned to swim as a kid, splashing around in Shewan Hollow's creeks. When Scarface Jack's crew chucked him into the Cumberland River, he didn't panic. He kicked hard, arms slicing through the cold current, aiming for shore. By the time he dragged himself onto the muddy bank, he was spent, lungs burning, legs like jelly. Dawn broke as he lay there, shivering. A couple of fishermen spotted him, hauled him up, and handed over some bread and a canteen. After a few bites and gulps, James's head cleared. Emily was still out there with those bastards. He had to move. He stumbled to the nearest town, a little river stop called Claybank, and marched straight to the sheriff's office. "I'm James Lewis," he told the deputy, voice raw. "New magistrate for Grayson County. Got ambushed on the river. Outlaws took my wife, threw me overboard. They've got my gear too, papers, everything." Without his magistrate's seal or any proof, the deputy squinted, skeptical. But a kidnapped wife? That lit a fire. The sheriff rounded up a posse and scoured the riverbanks. No sign of the boat. Jack and his crew had vanished. Case went cold, and James was left empty-handed. Meanwhile, Scarface Jack had steered the boat miles downstream, putting distance between them and Claybank. He leered at Emily, still tied up, eyes red from crying, and liked what he saw. "Boys, head to shore and grab some whiskey," he barked. "We're celebrating tonight." He turned to Emily, smirking. "Your man's gone, darlin'. Tonight, you're mine, wedding number 2. Stick with me, and I'll treat you right. Cross me, and you're feeding the fish." Emily didn't flinch at the threat. Death didn't scare her, but the thought that James might still be alive kept her going. She had to survive, find him somehow. She was no match for Jack and his brutes, not with her hands bound. "Fine," she said, voice steady. "I'll marry you. But James was my husband, I owe him mourning. Give me 7 weeks, then we'll do it." Jack sized her up, saw that fragile spark in her eyes, and softened, just a hair. "All right, 7 weeks," he grunted. "But no funny business, or you'll wish you hadn't." She stood at the boat's edge, staring at the rushing water, tears falling again. Jack tried sweet-talking her. "Quit your moping, I'll keep you happy." Emily wiped her face and said nothing. That night, Jack and his boys cracked open the whiskey, passing the jug around. Emily played along, pouring shots, keeping their cups full. They drank hard, Jack loudest of all, till they slumped over, dead drunk. She tugged at Jack's sleeve. "Jack? You awake?" No answer. Heart pounding, she leapt off the boat and ran into the dark. For 6 months, Emily wandered, begging scraps, asking after James at every tavern and trading post. No trace. She'd slipped Jack's grip, but the world felt hollow without her husband. Assuming he'd drowned, grief swallowed her. She'd think back to their riverboat promises, old and gray together, and sob till her chest ached. Life wasn't worth living alone. One day, she stood by a riverbank, ready to jump in and join him. Then a voice cut through, "Lord's mercy, child." Emily turned. An old Quaker woman, gray hair tucked under a bonnet, stood there, leaning on a stick. "Why throw your life away?" the woman asked, gentle but firm. Tears streaming, Emily spilled it all: riverboat, outlaws, James lost. The woman nodded slow. "All's fleeting, dear. Pain's real, but it's a shadow. Why cling to it?" "I loved him," Emily choked out. "We'd just started, now he's gone. What's left for me?" The Quaker saw Emily's heart wasn't budging. She kept talking soft and steady, till Emily's sobs eased. "I don't want to die," Emily whispered, "but I can't go on like this." She knelt before the woman. "Take me with you, I'm done with this world." The Quaker, seeing her lost and broken, agreed. She brought Emily to a quiet Quaker settlement, Peace Hollow, and there, Emily cut her hair short, took the name Sister Grace, and traded her old life for plain dresses and prayer. Sister Grace threw herself into the routine, sweeping floors, fetching water, tending the garden. She cooked, planted flowers, sat in silent worship, anything to keep busy. Exhaustion was her shield. If she stopped, James's face would flood back, tumbling into the river gone. Nights, she'd collapse into bed too tired to think. A year passed, and Peace Hollow's calm seeped in. Simple living, few wants, a kind of peace. But James still haunted her. Some days, she'd pause mid-task, eyes welling up, missing him fierce. One afternoon, Grace went out to collect alms for the settlement, walking the busy streets of a nearby town, Fairview. In the crowd, she froze. That scarred face, Jack Burke, strolling past like he owned the place. Her blood ran cold. Keeping her distance, she tailed him, bonnet low. He ducked into a fancy house on the edge of town. Grace knocked, heart thumping. The door creaked open. Sam Holt, one of Jack's crew, stood there. "Begging your pardon," Grace said, voice meek. "I'm collecting for the poor. Spare a coin for a blessing?" Sam shrugged, waved her inside. In the front room, Grace's eyes snagged on a wall hanging, James's rose sketch, the one he'd drawn on the boat. Her breath caught, but she held it together. No tears, not here. Jack swaggered in, tossing her a few coins. "You're in luck, sister," he said, smug. "I'm a big man round here. Take that for your prayers." Grace nodded, thanking him soft, but as she turned to go, Jack called out, "Hold up." She froze. He stepped closer, squinting. "You look familiar. Where've I seen you?" Grace's mind raced. "I've been at Peace Hollow," she lied quick. "Came from upriver last month. Maybe you passed through?" Jack scratched his chin. "Yeah, that's it. I was up that way once." "Thought so." Relief flooded her. She couldn't resist one last glance at the sketch. Jack caught it. "Like that picture? Take it, ain't my style." He yanked it off the wall and handed it over. "Hang it in your prayer house or whatever." Grace clutched it tight. "Thank you kindly, sir," she said, and bolted back to Peace Hollow, sketch trembling in her hands. Back at Peace Hollow, Sister Grace, Emily, burst in, clutching the rose sketch. Her hands shook, but her face glowed. The head Quaker, Mother Ruth, noticed right off. "Where'd you get that, Grace?" she asked, peering over her spectacles. "From a generous soul in Fairview," Grace said, steadying her voice. "Said it was a gift." Ruth took the sketch, admiring it. "Fine work, real pretty. Hang it in the meeting room, spruce the place up. County judge is coming tomorrow to pray with us, get it ready." Grace nodded and pinned the rose to the wall, heart pounding as she smoothed it flat. Next day, Judge Amos Carter rolled into Peace Hollow on his horse, a big man with a gray beard and a sharp eye. He joined the Quakers for worship, but that sketch caught him quick. The rose was striking, sure, but the handwriting scrawled across it, "To my M forever," hit him funny. He turned to Grace. "Who drew this?" She kept her tone even. "Got it collecting alms, sir. A kind fella gave it, no idea who made it." Amos rubbed his chin. "Sister, I'd like to buy this off you, name your price." Grace smiled soft. "If it speaks to you, Judge, take it, no charge. Call it a good deed." Amos thanked her warm and rode off with the sketch tucked in his saddlebag. On the road back to Grayson County, Amos's horse spooked, and his wagon clipped a man sketching by the roadside. The judge hollered to stop, hopping down to check. It was James Lewis, disheveled, paint smeared, but not bad hurt, just scraped up. His latest drawing, a river scene, lay in the dirt. Amos scooped it up, then froze. "You do this?" he asked, holding it out. James nodded, brushing off his coat. "Yes, sir, keeps me busy." Amos grinned. "Boy, you've got talent, better than most I've seen. Come to my place, paint me something, I'll pay good." James, flattered, agreed. "Happy to, Judge, lead the way." At the county courthouse, Amos set James up in his study with a fresh canvas. James whipped up a landscape, hills, a stream, alive as real. Amos clapped him on the back. "Damn fine work. Now look at this, tell me how it stacks up." He pulled the rose sketch from a drawer and handed it over. James took one look and went white. "Where'd you get this, Judge?" he rasped. "I drew it, gave it to my wife, Emily, on a riverboat. Thought she was dead." Tears spilled down his face as he told the whole mess: outlaws, the river, losing her. Amos listened, stunned, then put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't break yet, son. I'll track this down, might settle your score." James dropped to his knees, choking out thanks. Amos figured that sketch tied back to Peace Hollow, and maybe Emily. He sent his wife, Martha Carter, to poke around. Martha rode out next day, asking Mother Ruth about the drawing's origins. Ruth shrugged. "Our sister Grace brought it in, said a Fairview man gave it. No writing on it then, guess she added that herself." Martha smiled. "I've always liked Grace's spirit. Mind if she visits us a spell? I'd love to chat with her." Ruth called Grace over, explained, and Grace agreed, riding back with Martha, nervous but curious. At the courthouse, Martha sat Grace down. "That note on the sketch, what's it mean?" Grace's eyes welled up before she could speak. She spilled it: riverboat, Jack's gang, James thrown overboard. "Thought he drowned," she finished, voice breaking. "Gave up, joined the Quakers, Sister Grace now." Martha hugged her tight, then ran to tell Amos. The judge's jaw dropped. "Get James in here," he barked. When James and Grace locked eyes, time stopped. Joy and pain crashed together. They fell into each other's arms, sobbing loud. James explained his side: saved by fishermen, brushed off by the old sheriff, sketching ever since to find her. He'd thought her gone too. Now here they were, alive together, a miracle. With the truth out, Amos didn't waste time. He sent deputies to Fairview, hauling Scarface Jack in chains to the courthouse. Jack swaggered into the dock, but when he saw James standing there, his smirk died. He knew the game was up. Amos slammed his gavel, ordering 50 lashes to break Jack's swagger, then laid out the charges. Beaten bloody, Jack faced James's sketch, Emily's testimony, guilt nailed tight. He confessed, head low, and the judge sentenced him hard, hanging by week's end. James and Emily, reunited, clung tight. With Amos's pull, James took his magistrate post in Grayson County. Their love deepened, stronger for the scars. Amos and Martha, childless after years, took a shine to Emily, adopting her as their own in spirit. She honored them like parents, tending them in their old age. Jack's gang scattered, his loot seized, and the river ran quiet again. And that's the tale, folks. James and Emily made it through hell to find each other. If you liked it, leave a note below, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Thanks for sticking with me. Catch you next time for another wild yarn.